All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for logging into to our webinar this afternoon. My name is Matthew Reeves. I'm Director of Archaeology, and originally this was supposed to be a live walk tour of the woods here at Montpelier. And unfortunately, with the closure and everything that's going on, we had to cancel that because the property, Montpelier property, is closed right now, like so many places are. And what we decided to do is to experiment with this as a webinar. So again, originally this was not intended to be a webinar. It was intended to be a walking tour. But what we decided to do was to do some experimentation with PowerPoint. I did some videos in the woods earlier this week. And for those of you all that know me, you'll know that my love for PowerPoint. You can do quite a bit with PowerPoint with multimedia displays and try to get you all back into the woods virtually. So for the engagement part of this, I mean, one thing you have when you're live with people on a tour, on a walking tour especially, I've done these with about 30 people out in the woods, is you have to stop every 5 minutes or so and gather everybody up and see if there are questions so you don't leave any stragglers behind. And that's what we want to do here. With Zoom, you've got a couple of different options to interact with us. And Christy Moriarty is my co-host today. She's sitting here on the other side of the lab so we don't get feedback and maintaining proper social distance. So if you have questions, you can type them in. And as those come in, Christy will call those out to me. The other thing that you can do is you can raise your hand. I see one person has their hand raised, and you can either type questions or Christy can unmute you and you can ask questions. So and a couple of times through this talk, we're going to experiment with this to see how this works. I'm going to ask questions and you all can raise your hands for a survey or just type in questions that you have. And then near the end, what we'd like to do is open up everything for dialogue. But if somebody does have a burning question during the program, go ahead and raise your hand and we'll experiment with this. So if everybody's all set, we'll go ahead and begin. Again, thanks for being here today. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share my screen, and this is going to go over to the PowerPoint. And so where we were going to be walking today, of course, is on the Montpelier property. And Montpelier, as you all know, is home of James and Dolly Madison. There's over 100 enslaved individuals that lived and worked at Montpelier. And where the main house is at Montpelier is in this visitor core. When you look at the property mass, we've got about 2,700 acres, and the visitor core consists of about 50 acres. So most people's experience when they come to Montpelier is in this 50-acre area, which is shown on the map as a visitor core. And the rest of the property, the rest of the 2,700 acres, is really not all that accessible. But during the plantation days, this was all the property, just about all the property was part of the Montpelier plantation. On the map, what I'm showing right here is the area in white is what is Montpelier today. Montpelier is 2,700 acres. What's in red, what was owned by the Madisons for about 150 years during their ownership of Montpelier. And where we're going to be walking today is over in what's called the East Woods. So for those of y'all that are familiar with Montpelier, you know about the North Woods where the Gilmore Cabin is and the Civil War camps are up in this area. This is Chicken Mountain where Grelin Nursery is, and we have the trail that goes over the mountain there. But the East Woods, you've got the area of the landmark forest in here, but a good section of this 500 acres of East Woods is pretty much inaccessible to the public. And what we've got on this side is a whole other plantation that was being worked by gangs of slaves during the Madison era. And we've discovered this through metal detector survey and lidar that we've recently had flown. So much like in the visitor core, a lot of the history of Montpelier is not immediately visible. We've spent the past 20 years doing excavations in areas such as the South Yard, where we found the quarters for house slaves. And we did excavations there starting in 2011, and this culminated most recently with the restoration of the South Yard. Similarly, over by the Visitor Center, in this image on the right, you can see the Visitor Center at the top of the hill here. We found a set of field quarters where field slaves are living and working. And what we've done in that area is, based on the archaeology, we have reconstructed the slave quarter, the living quarter of those individual households that were in that area. Now, what has allowed archaeology to do this is, anytime you've got a living site, a site where people are living for 10 or 15 years, there's all kinds of trash that gets generated. You get everything from broken ceramics, broken bottle glass, animal bone, tobacco pipes. All this accumulates. And then when we go in and test this with the archaeology, dig our shovel test bits, which are about 1 foot in diameter, and we dig every 15 to 20 feet, we start to find concentrations of artifacts. So where you've got these domestic sites and you've got years of deposits of trash, these sites are relatively easy to find. They show up with standard archaeological testing techniques. But for other sites that make up the plantation, such as the work areas, such as storage sheds, granaries, these kind of buildings that were the majority of the buildings on the property don't have this broadcast scatter of domestic debris. Basically, if these buildings decayed in the ground, what do you all think would be left for one of these buildings? There's no one living there, so you're not going to get the ceramics, the glass. If that building either burned or decayed in place, what would you find today as evidence for it? And you all can go ahead and type in your response, or if anybody wants to raise their hand and answer it, we could try that as well. Yeah, Christy's going to read some of these.
Okay. Let's see. Nails, foundation, ash left from fires, nails, 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 nails,
Yes.
nails, decayed wood at best, subfloor pits, nails, and rock.
So it sounds like the overwhelming answer is nails, and all the rest of those things are absolutely true. It's, in some cases, you would find foundations. You do find ash at some of these sites where the building burned, but what shows up just absolutely beautifully is nails. And this is where we use combine metal detector surveys with our gridded surveys to have these nails show up. And let's try a show of hands. We'll try this survey function. Go ahead and raise your hand if you've heard about metal detectorists and archaeologists working together. How many hands did we get, Christy?
We have 21 raised hands. Nope, wow. 22.
Wow, so we get a lot of people that are familiar with what we do at Montpelier, so which is great. And some of the other folks that have signed up who actually have worked with archaeologists and are metal detectorists, and vice versa, archaeologists who have worked with metal detectorists. Yeah, for the past 15 years, we've been working with metal detectorists on the surveys that we do at Montpelier. And really, this has allowed us to locate the vast majority of the historic sites that we've been studying on the property. What's been great about this is, through metal detector survey, and I'll talk about this in a second, is not only you're able to identify the sites, but you're also able to date them by the nail manufacturer. Now, these work sites, these buildings, of course, aren't where the majority of slaves are spending most of their time. Where most folks were spending their time were out in the fields, either at processing sites or in the fields themselves. And so in these fields, you don't find all that much in terms of the tools of the trade, the hose, the plows, an occasional horseshoe. But this is where lidar comes in, and this is what we'll be talking about today. Is the lidar, what it is we had this flown 2 years ago at Montpelier, and I'll be showing lidar maps in a few minutes. What lidar allows you to produce are these incredibly high resolution terrain maps. Recently, archaeologists in Ecuador used lidar to literally be able to see through the canopy and see through the ground surface to find these extensive Mayan cities that were attached to these, monumental pyramids that were there in the Amazon jungle. So we did a similar study here at Montpelier, where in the wintertime, when the leaves are off the trees, we flew lidar, and what we found is literally thousands of linear features that relate to the agricultural activities, the work areas, the roads that were here during the Madison period. And these, combined with the metal detector survey, that's given us all kinds of information about the activities on the plantation. Now, when you visit most plantations, most of the time you're visiting the main house. Why we're interested in finding all these work areas is we're really interested in doing full-scale restoration here at Montpelier of not just the living areas, but also the working areas of the enslaved community. And what this allows us to do is to do two things. One is we don't have the maps that show where these fields and working areas don't survive. These records are burned in the 1850s by the Madison family. And so it's literally the preservation we have here at Montpelier allows us to find the physical evidence to be able to reconstruct what the plantation looked like. And this allows us to tell, whole truth history, as it's termed, which, brings everybody into the picture that was here. And so, of course, we're relying on the archaeological record for this. Now, what this also tells us about is the kind of labor that was going on here at Montpelier. And under the Madisons, you've got about 120 years of Madison ownership of Montpelier. There are 3 generations of Madisons, all of whom really were working, having their slaves work the land in very different ways. The first generation of Madisons under Frances Madison, she is the grandmother of the president. She, for the most part, had slaves growing tobacco, and in this early stage, the most common technique was what's generally known as slash and burn horticulture, where trees were girdled that caused the leaves to die, and then slaves were forced to hoe the soil into hills and then plant the tobacco. So they weren't using plows so much as hoes. And while this didn't cause a lot of erosion, because you still had a lot of the root systems that retain the soil from the trees, what happened is that tobacco, which is incredibly nutrient dependent, sucked the nutrients out of the soil. Combined with the erosion, it made tobacco all but impractical by the time of the American Revolution. And this is when James Madison's father, James Madison Sr., and his wife, Nellie Madison, take control of the plantation after his mother's death. And what they begin doing at that point is introducing plow agriculture to Montpelier. And at this point in the American Revolution, there's more in the Piedmont, there's more of an emphasis on growing grains, tobacco, not so much tobacco, but on corn and wheat and other grains. And the problem with the early plowing is the kind of plowing that was used was called directional plowing, where instead of plowing with the contours, usually the easiest way to plow on a slope is to plow up and then down the slope. And then what this causes is basically you get these rills or furrows that are formed. And when you have an intense rainstorm, this channelizes the water into single streams and causes thousands of tons of soil to wash down from the top of the slopes down into the bottomlands. And this is what we've seen with the lidar surveys we've done at Montpelier. By the time James Madison Jr., the son of James Madison Sr. and Nellie, takes over the plantation in 1792, he begins to recognize the poor effects of this kind of plowing, and he introduces more scientific farming with his overseer and the gangs of slaves. And they begin what's known as contour plowing, where you plow with the contours of the land, and you essentially try to make the land into smaller terraces that aren't as susceptible to erosion. And at the same time, what he's having his slaves and the overseers engage in is manuring of fields, experimenting with different sorts of processing tools, such as threshing machines, and tries to improve production. But by the time that James and Dolly Madison retired to Montpelier in 1817, he writes that during his entire retirement, he doesn't have one successful crop except for tobacco. And this is something that really got our interest, and you'll see the relevance of this when we get back into the Eastwoods. So by the time you get into the retirement years in the 1820s, By the time Madison passes away after about 20 years of retirement in 1836, he's sold about a third of the slaves here at Montpelier. So they're turning from producing crops to selling slaves to make up for some of their debts. When James Madison Jr. dies in 1836, Dolly takes over the operation of the plantation with her son, John Payne Todd. And by 1844, they've sold another third of the slaves. And by the time she sells the property in 1844, by this time they sell all the slaves, and all the buildings at Montpelier by 1848 have been razed, except of course for the main house and the temple. So what you've got is you go from Montpelier having over 100 enslaved individuals at one time living on and working the land, to when you get into the 1840s, you have less than 25 people working the land. And with that, what you get is a lot less land being worked and more areas returning to woods. And I see there's a couple of questions, Christy.
I just see 3 ways to answer that.
Okay. Yeah, if anybody has any questions, it might be easier to type your questions into the chat. And we'll open it up for an open discussion afterwards. And if you see any questions, just shout them out to me, Christy.
Yeah.
So with the sale of the property in 1848, what also happens is that the focus of the plantation, where the main farm complex is moved over to where the archaeology lab is, where Christy and I are right now. It's the location of where the Constitution Village is in Lewis Hall, and the area that was the main Madison Farm Complex, which is below the Visitor Center, which you can see in this screen right here, is pretty much abandoned, and it remained as pasture up until the present day, when we started doing studies in this area for the construction of the Visitor Center. And when we did the surveys for the Visitor Center, what we found in the field, just about a third of a mile away from the mansion, was site after site related to the Madison era. There were slave quarters, stables, work sheds, tobacco and threshing barns, an overseer's house, a blacksmith shop, and multiple slave quarters. And in the process of excavating these, what was most obvious were these domestic sites, and also the blacksmith site that had a large amount of artifacts. So these sites that are shown in blue here showed up with standard testing techniques, but what didn't initially show up were these barns. These didn't show up through our shovel test pits. What we had to do was conduct metal detector surveys to find these. And as I'll get to in a second, reason why we're talking about this home farm complex when we're supposed to be out in the middle of the woods walking around looking for evidence, is this farm complex that we found here down the hill from the Visitor Center is exactly what we found in the Eastwood. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to go over our metal detector surveys in the area below the Visitor Center right on the screen here to talk about what was there, and then use that to reflect on what we're seeing in the woods on the other side of Montpelier's landmass. So when we were conducting the excavations in the home farm and across the property, what we've started to do with surveys of the property is to do metal detector surveys and do them on a 20-meter grid. And the map you see right here, again, what's outlined in red is the Montpelier property. The areas that are in green and yellow and red are where we've done metal detector surveys. And each one of these tiny squares is 20 meters by 20 meters, which is about 1/10 of an acre. And what we do is in each one of those squares, we have metal detectorists sweep that 20 meter by 20 meter area. This is about 66 feet by 66 feet. And any hits they find, we map them in, sample them to see whether they're a historic hit. And then what we can do is we can do a hit count on each of these squares to see what the artifact density is. So for example, this is where the red dot is. This is the main house. This is the visitor center right here. The aerial shot I showed of the fields below the visitor center is this area right here. So you can see this concentration of red in amongst this green, low concentration of artifacts. This shows there's quite a few sites. And then over here in the East Woods, you've got a similar, red dot there, a couple of red dots there. But for focusing in right here, when we find these nails, what we're able to do is not only know that we've got a historic site, but we're actually able to date the site. So these nails, about every 30 years from the time of the American Revolution up until the 1840s, you get a change in nail manufacture. The early nails are hand forged nails. That's the, around the time of the American Revolution. When you get into the 1790s, you get these machine cut nails with either a handmade head or a hand forged tip. And then during the retirement years, you get into fully machine made nails. And then in the post-Madison era, you get these a different form of machine made nails that are different enough from these earlier machine made nails that when you find in the ground, you can actually identify them. So what this allows us to do is not only find these sites using nails, but then also to date them. So when we focus in on the home farm complex below the visitor center, we'll zoom into this area. Again, here's the visitor center, here's the main house. What you can see on this map is these red concentrations are areas where we've got some pretty substantial sites. And when you look at this area in detail, what you can see is we can start picking out sites from these 20-meter. Oh, let's see. All right. Someone said they lost audio. Is everybody else able to hear me? Kind of worst nightmare is to get too far into this. Oh, thumbs up. Okay, thanks. If anybody lost audio, you could type the question to Christy, and actually what you could do is Christy could type the phone number in here into the lab, and you could call. The extension here is 163, Christy. So, but for the home farm complex, what we're able to find here is about 8 different sites in this area. And then by dating these, by dating the nails, we're actually able to date the site. So the Mount Pleasant site, the early Madison home, dates to the 18th century. You've got this tobacco barn dating to the 1790s. And then the rest of the sites date to the retirement years. So with these 20 meter surveys, again, each of these squares is 20 meters by 20 meters. We're able to find the sites, but then what we're able to do is go in and do even a finer grid survey to find the buildings. So in this picture down here, you can see this 20-meter grid. And then what we do is once we find these sites, we lay out a 10-foot grid to get even better resolution on the artifact count. So for example, over here at the overseer's house, while initially the overseer's house looked quite large, once we did the 10-foot metal detector survey and really refined the resolution of these nail scatters, you can see that the main concentration is right in this area. This is where we're doing our excavations this season to find the overseer's house. Now, one of the sites that we're want to talk about today is this tobacco barn. The tobacco barn was a site that didn't have a lot of artifacts, but it had an interesting pattern with the surveys that we did. And when we zoom in on this area, what you can see is there's a concentration of artifacts here. And when we did the survey, what we found is not just nails, but we also started finding threshing teeth. And these threshing teeth, they are these wedge-shaped wrought iron teeth that go into a threshing machine. And we knew from the historical records, once we found these, that Madison had a threshing machine built in the 1790s. And so this is what we were able to figure out. This was potentially a threshing barn. So we were interested in doing some investigations on this. In 2013, we started opening up units in this area. And what we found initially was not a threshing barn, but what appeared to be a tobacco barn that had these charred trenches that formed squares that were for smoke curing tobacco. But once we get into these deposits, what we found in the middle here was an area where there's hundreds of threshing parts in the middle of this here, with posts that indicated there's a threshing machine here. And what we're able to figure out about this barn is in the 18 teens, it transitioned from being a tobacco barn to a threshing barn with the changing agricultural practices at Montpelier. So with this, what we're able to really show is not only what was going on at this site, but really the power of these metal detector surveys to find sites. So with the combination of the 10-foot and the 20-meter surveys, what we've been able to do at the fields below the visitor center is really begin to flesh out an interpretation of this site. And most recently, we worked with the University of Arkansas's Center for Advanced Spatial Technology to build this 3D map of the visitor center area. So if we toggle between the aerial view, this is Westgate Road coming up here, and up here is the visitor center. And on this 3D map, here's Westgate Road coming up here. Here's the location of the visitor center and parking lot today. And then what you see out in these fields is this basically this working village of mainly work areas with scatters of field slave quarters in this area, the overseer's house over here. But today, there's not much there. There's not a lot there that allows visitors to be able to imagine this. Now, we're over the next 3 years. Oh, Christy said we have a question. Yeah.
And I apologize for the delay. The question is, Thomas Jefferson had a nail factory on Monticello. Any evidence of nails made in the fashion that he made?
While we don't have evidence that they were manufacturing nails here like that, we do have nails from the nailery that are here at Montpelier. And we're thinking Madison was buying those nails in the 1790s when he's moving the blacksmith shop from where it was at the temple under his parents' operation out to the area right over here. In fact, in this 3D map, the blacksmith shop is just off the image in this direction. Are there any other questions, Christy?
No, I was going to say, I think some of the hands are raised from your original question at the beginning of the webinar.
Okay.
So if you want to lower your hands, that way I'm not mistakenly thinking someone wants to chat.
All right, that sounds good. So, but the reason why we're talking so much about the home farm complex is basically this area that we found below the visitor center is essentially the same model for this we found out in the Eastwoods. So if we go out to the Eastwoods, what you'll see is, so here's the area we were just talking about here below the main house. The area of the Eastwoods, we found a similar complex that has all these elements to it, threshing barns, tobacco barns, slave quarters, but it's instead of being in a field like we found here below the visitor center, it's in the middle of woods, and it makes it much more difficult for people to imagine. And it makes it really exciting because it's absolutely unexpected to be in a woodlot that folks thought were, ancient woodlots from the Madison era, which clearly they're not, because if you have a farm complex in the middle of what today are woods, well, back in the day, those would have been fields because you can't grow crops in the woods. So going to the Eastwoods, the next image is a blow up of this area right here. And again, where we're going to walk today is we're going to go from the visitor center, walk along the trails from the landmark forest, and then bushwhack our way back into the Eastwoods, into this area right here. So going into the Eastwoods for more detail, this is a map showing the 20-meter survey that we conducted about 6 years ago out in the Eastwoods. And what we found are a number of sites, barns, and buildings. And then we laid out a 10-foot grid in these areas. And that's when we really began to be able to refine not only where these buildings are, but the dates of these buildings. Pretty much all these buildings date to the 1820s up until the 1850s, shortly before the Civil War. And there's a couple of these sites that were really compelling. One of the first ones we excavated was a barn that all we found were collections of burnt cut nails. It's at the top of a hill. There's no distinguishing ground features that in the woods that showed that there was a barn there. But for these concentrations of burnt nails, what we know we have is a barn that burned. And based on the absence of any tools, we're thinking it could have been a tobacco barn. We were theorizing about this 6 years ago and thinking it might be a tobacco barn. And what I'll show you in the lidar really clinches that story. Now, the next barn we found was one where there's a large concentration of nails, but we also found were threshing teeth, similar to the barn we found out below the visitor center. And we literally found the face of the McCormick threshing machine that was broken and abandoned at this site. So just some incredible evidence for the threshing machine at this one barn site. So with a combination of a tobacco barn and a wheat threshing barn, it shows that you've got multiple crop types that are being produced in these fields. Now, the other site that we found here was a slave quarter. And at the slave quarter, what we found were, the nails where the building was, but we also found a scissor blades, we found thimbles, we found buttons. And when we went in and did testing in this area, we found, your standard scatters of ceramics, bone, and glass. What we also found in the surveys of the slave quarter was something that's visible when you're walking on the landscape. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a video next that I took about 2 days ago walking out to this site. And one thing I learned about doing videos and looking at them later is I'm definitely not quitting my day job to become a cinematographer. And if anyone has motion sickness, you might want to close your eyes because I need to slow down on my camera swings. But here is this this video, and let's go into this and let me know if what we found in this area through metal detector survey was a slave quarter. We not only found nails that you typically find at these early 19th century sites, but there's a lot of really old trees, remnant trees in here, like this oak right here, this old oak skeleton. And then up through into the spice bush here, what you can begin to just make out is this darker blob right in front of me is an old locust grove stump that rests on top of a mound. And when you look at this mound, what we've got are all kinds of stones. And at first when we found this, we thought, oh, maybe it's from clearing of fields. But when you make your way around this, what you can begin to see are bricks. So for example, this right here is a brick, another brick right here, and all the stones right here make up the base of what was a chimney. And then where this old locust stump is, this black locust stump is located, this is where the hearth would have been. And this this chimney would have been, the stone chimney would have been topped by a brick flue, and that's where all the bricks are coming from. Through metal detector survey, what we found was a large concentration of not just nails, but we also found architectural hardware like door hinges. We found buttons, all items that indicated that not only was there a building here, but someone was living here. You had domestic debris that had been scattered throughout this area. And based on the architecture that we found with this chimney base and the lack of any piers, we're thinking this was a slave quarter, probably a log structure with a stone chimney base and a brick flue. And the location of this chimney base is this old black locust tree. This locust tree, locusts tend to only grow in areas on the edges of fields or recently abandoned areas. So this locust probably started growing sometime shortly after the structure was abandoned. And based on the growth of how quickly these grow in woods, this tree probably was cut maybe 50 or 60 years ago. You can actually see there's the cut stump right there. And then over here, if I pan over here, you can see where the top of the tree was. So we can get a gauge of just how big this tree was running from the top of the tree over to the stump. And what's quite remarkable and almost altar-like about this black locust tree is it's in the exact place where the family's hearth would have been. And more than likely, the top of that cut for this locust would have been probably where the lintel was for the chimney, just representing the height. So this black locust tree represents the abandonment of this structure, but in many ways is a nice representation of the chimney base that was out in this area. Now, from the archaeology, we found a nice concentration of architectural hardware in the area right beside the hearth. We're thinking, if I step back here a little, you can get a sense of this area, how flat it is by where the hearth was located. That's where the structure was located. And then the rest of this area, you've got this flat location that would have been where the yard was. So this is where the daily tasks would have been taking place. We found from. So that gives you an idea of some of these domestic structures that are in this area, and also an idea of some of my camera skills. I'll be curious about comments for those. But for these buildings that we have out in the woods, we're able to find these with metal detector surveys. But for the other parts that we're looking for, the other parts of the farm that would have been the fields and some of the work areas, agricultural ditches, road traces, field lines, plow furrows, none of these can be found with metal detector survey. And because there's not concentrations of artifacts located there. So what we're relying on for those are the lidar surveys. And as I mentioned earlier, lidar surveys, basically, they allow you, we had these flown 2 years ago, and they allow us to create these highly high resolution terrain maps of the landscape. And so, for example, if you look at Chicken Mountain here blown up, you can zoom in and see that, on this slope, you've got all these erosional gullies in this area, right in this location here. And this red line right here is a cross section shown right here. And this shows how this lidar works. When the lidar is flown, not only do you get the ground surface, but you also get the entire tree canopy as well. And what we had to do was segregate out the above ground data from the ground data, and then take those ground points to create this digital elevation map that shows the lidar. And fortunately, when we had flown the lidar, one of our staff is working on his master's on lidar. He took all of this data and basically digitized all the linear features that you could see in the lidar maps. And he literally came across 2,500 features. There were everything from field edges to property lines. There were even plow furrows, erosional gullies, agricultural ditches, and then also road traces. And putting these together with the metal detector survey, what this gives us is a complete picture of what we've got here at Montpelier. And by studying these in tandem, we're able to develop a more nuanced story of what these parts of the plantation looked like. So going back to the East Woods and looking at what we found where all these barn structures are, one of the most noticeable features that showed up in these lidar surveys were all these erosional gullies. And when you see them out in the woods today, they're these deep scars on the side of the slopes. And what they come from is in the 18th century, and when these fields are being plowed around the Revolutionary War period, and you had directional plowing occurring, this is what caused this massive erosion where the soil gets washed from the top of the slope down the slopes. And then what happens is it accumulates in this bottomland to fill up these old remnant valleys with silts. And within these silt-filled valleys, what you start to notice are all these very straight streams. And what these streams are these ditch streams that are cut into all these accumulated sediments. So this white line right here represents an approximation of where the original stream valley was from this point to this point. All this is flattened out from all these eroded sediments. And then Madison had his slaves cut these ditches to drain this area so these areas could be worked agriculturally. And we have the evidence from that from the plow furrows that you can see in the lidar right here. So literally with the in these flat areas, you can't see it with the naked eye, but with a lidar, you can see these slight linear features that are the last set of plow furrows from the 1840s. And I've got another video, walking down into this area. I walked from below this tobacco barn down into this valley right here where these tobacco fields were. And so let's take a look at this. And while I play the video, I'm going to highlight on this map where I am in the video so you can follow along. I am just down the hill from where the tobacco barn is. And this is all what would have been more than likely fields in the 1820s, 1830s, but probably more fields for growing grain crops. So these areas would have been plowed, but the soil would have been much too nutrient poor to grow tobacco. Where we're thinking the tobacco was grown is further down in these bottomlands. So you can see I'm at the edge of what would have been a field back in the 1820s. You can see below is the road trace there. And then further out, what you can see, you might be able to make out the stream down below there. That's where we're going to head next. I'm going to turn the camera off because probably if I left it on and jostled you all around, I'd either fall over and get hurt or make you all sick. So I'll be back in a sec. And that descent wasn't that bad, so I'm going to put the video back on. But we're going down the hill towards the stream. You can see I just filmed this 2 days ago, and the greenery is just starting to come out, all the spice bushes coming out. And for years we knew about these streams, and it wasn't until we had the lidar and we started looking at them in map form that we realized how straight these are. And if you get down into the stream here and you look down this way, you can see this stream is just straight as an arrow. And so you've got this stream right here, and then just across the channel there, or across this area, this flat area, there is another stream. And this one, this is the head of this channel right here, you can see. And this one is straight as an arrow as well. And you can see from the lidar map that I had on the screen earlier, these streams run for close to 1/4 of a mile with this straight shot. And if you look across in between, you've got this flat area. And one thing that Drew Lanham noticed when he and I were down here a couple of weeks ago is there's no stream wash. You don't have any leaves that have accumulated around any of the bushes, the spice bush here. And that's despite some of the earlier rains we had this season. And so, and also Drew looked at the vegetation that's in this area. There are no sycamores. These are all tulip poplars, which are typical of these highland areas in the Piedmont. But what it means is this area is completely drained by these agricultural ditches that Madison slaves cut through here about 180 years ago. So basically what the enslaved community was able to do was to drain this area to the point where all this eroded sediment that fills this flat land was able to be plowed. And yet we have the evidence for that from the plow scars in the lidar. And this would have been viable agricultural fields for tobacco, because you've got an incredibly thick layer of topsoil through this area, and it would have mimicked what this soil profile would have looked like about 280 years ago when this area was initially settled by the great-great-great-grandparents of the enslaved folks that cut these ditches into this area. So with that video, you can see, you've got multiple ecozones today that represent multiple historic parts of this plantation that today is all in woods. And so with the, what we've been able to find with the lidar for the evidence for the fields, these agricultural ditches, so you've got, they bring the, this pointer back again, the laser pointer. In these low areas is where tobacco is being grown in this area. And then in these uplands areas these are the areas that are being plowed probably for corn and grains that aren't so nutrient dependent as tobacco in the bottomlands. And then you've got these different barns that are used for processing the different crops. The tobacco barn here for the tobacco fields, this threshing barn that would have been for the grain crops grown in these upland areas. Now, if you look on this map, what you'll start to see is, again, this is all in woods today. This is, if you look at an aerial, which I'll show in a second, completely covered in woods, you'll start to see all these other linear patterns that are in this area. And what these are these old road traces that connect all these barns. Some of these are bridle trails that were used by the DuPonts in the earlier in the 20th century, but there's several paths that have trees growing in them that date to over 100 years old. And also through metal detector survey, we've been able to find early artifacts in these that show these are earlier paths. And there's one particular set of one road trace up here that really, when you look at this in the woods, you can really see how these roads are created. And I've got a another video here that illustrates this. So this is up again, this is up in this area where you can see, this slight linear dimple here in the lidar map. But then when you're out here in the landscape, this road is quite obvious. We're in the Eastwoods again, walking up one of the road traces that dates back to the Madison era. And this one is pretty spectacular. You can see in this case that the road is this flat area right in front. The portion of the road where my fingers are framing are right here. And the slope before this road was built by slaves came and cut across here. And what the enslaved laborers did was cut the bank and then brought that fill to create this cut and fill road trace. These dot the woods at Montpelier, and are some of the more visible remains of roads that are out here. Some of the other ones can only be seen through lidar, not even with eye when you're out in the woods. But this one runs along for about a mile into the woods and then circles up into the fields that where the double line of tulip poplars is located. So this road network with the lidar combined with the evidence of the fields, we're able to build a fairly complete picture of the landscape. But one of the other lines of evidence that we're looking at and we're just beginning to explore, I mentioned Dr. Drew Lanham when I was down in the bottomland right here when he visited about 3 weeks ago, and we were assessing some of these bottomlands. Dr. Drew Lanham is an ornithologist at Clemson, and he's very interested in looking at the intersection between these natural habitats today and the historic uses of these landscapes back in the period of slavery, and see how these two interacted. And one thing we're very interested in working on with one of his graduate students, William, is looking at some of the remnant tree vegetation that's out here. So again, all this is woods today, and underneath the canopy is this network of evidence for the plantation. And then within the woods, what you've got are literally these living legacies of trees that date back to the Madison era. So for example, there are several areas where there are these massive field-grown tulip poplars that more than likely grew in pastures, and then when those pastures were abandoned, the other trees came up around it to surround them. You've got old field edges marked by oak trees and other tulip poplars that have these limbs reaching out where the open field was. And then in some cases, even more spectacularly shown are these ancient pine trees, these carcasses of pine trees that are laying in amongst the hardwoods. And what we've found is there are some areas of the woods of Montpelier that are littered with these pine carcasses. And when you look at these, while it looks like a smaller pine trunk, this pine trunk was about 5 times its size. And what's happened is that the softwood is rotted, and you've gotten down to the sapwood right here, the rich pitch-filled wood that doesn't rot. And these pine trees only grow up in areas that have been plowed and where the trees can take hold quite quickly and outcompete the hardwoods. Now, one of these, when you're out in the woods, you begin to see some of these tree lines. And even if you're not in the woods, with a lidar, you can see some of these. So this is where the video we just looked at for this double line of streams right in this area is right here. That road trace is right in this area. What you'll notice over here are all what looks to be little pimples on the landscape. And when you look at this in lidar, what you've got this is a line of ancient tulip poplars that are in this area. And when you look at how this line arranges with property lines from the Madison era, it's right on a property line that Dolly Madison had sold to the next owner in 1844. And when you look at the 37 aerial, this is the 1937 aerial these aerials have flown all over the US. You can see in the mid 20th century, this was an open field that was an ancient pasture that had not been worked for probably about 80 to about 100 years. And when you go out on the landscape today, this little video clip here shows what these trees look like. And I'll talk a little bit about the significance of these tulip poplars in this area. for looking for clues for these ancient fields in the woods, we're standing here in the middle of the East Woods right now. You can either use what we've been talking about just now with lidar and look for linear patterns of landscape features, or you can actually use the trees themselves. And in this case, in the East Woods, I'm looking at one of those clues. What's in front of me is a stump for a tulip poplar that the tulip poplar, probably when it was cut, it was about 90 to 100 years old, and it was cut about 30 years ago. And since that time, there are about 6 different sprouts that have come up. And right now, if you look up, you can see there are 2 or 3 that are pretty dominant. And probably over the next 10 years or so, there's going to be 2 left on either side, and they'll become what are known as these double tulip poplars. And just down the hill from here, we've got some wonderful examples of these that actually mark the edge of an old field that dates back at least to Dolly Madison's time when she sold the property in 1844. Let's head down there and take a look. Now, as we walk down the hill, there's all kinds of trees through here, but you'll start noticing there's this collection of very large trees that have these double leaders, or these double trunks. And as you get closer and get in line with these, all of a sudden you can see these form this almost looks like a fortress out here of tulip poplar trees. And when you walk up to this one right here along the this bridle trail, you'll notice this large rock, and it lines up with all of these trees, and they form a straight line that runs for about 100 feet. And when you take a look at some of these trees, what you'll see, and what makes them very unique, is they've got these, all of them are these twin tulip poplars that originated out of an earlier tulip poplar that had been cut down. And similar to just up the hill, you have 2 or 3 tulip sprouts that start coming out, or 4 or 5, and then 2 of these become dominant, and then you got this line of double tulip poplars. So what we've got here is, for all of these trees, is these are the scions of an earlier set of tulip poplars that were all probably cut down at the same time. And what's come from these are these next generation of tulip poplars. It's basically the same living organism because it's the same root system. But what you have is the next generation of tulip poplars that are growing up here. So based on the age of these tulip poplars, we have not done dendrochronology on these, but just looking at them and working with Harry Puffenberger, he estimated that these might be between 90 to 120 years old. So assuming 100, these might have been cut down when the DuPonts first bought the property. And the trees that would have been cut down potentially were another 80 to 100 years old. So you've got a line here that dates back to maybe 160, 180 years ago. And when you overlay this in GIS, where this line of tulip poplar is, what it lines up with is a sale of property that Dolly Madison made in 1844. And this is that map that I was showing just before this video. And so this is where that line of tulip poplars that we just walked down to see are located. And if you look in the lidar map, you can see all these dots right here are these tulip poplars that show up in this point cloud in this area. So literally what we've got is, these trees that are along here potentially are a witness to the plantation period of an old tree line. And one of Dr. Lanham's students is interested in looking at some of the DNA from these trees to determine if there's ways that we can date trees from the DNA and also do descent lines, basically a tree ancestry.com, to see how all these trees are related in this area and begin to really look at this area as an ecosystem, not so much from, not just from a naturalist point of view, but also from a historical point of view, and start to bring together all these lines of evidence that are out here at Montpelier. So the kind of to pull this all together, and after that we'll open up the floor for discussion. Is what we've done at Montpelier is we've been very successful at being able to show the lives of slaves and the Madisons in and around the historic core. And what we want to do, though, is begin to really push the boundaries on looking at the agricultural operations of the estate. And where this comes from is the really need to make the history more inclusive. In working with the descendant community, what they've asked for is to have us move beyond the main house, not just talk about the house slaves like Paul Jennings, which is a very necessary story, but also include the stories of the field slaves and what their contributions are. And one of the really exciting aspects of this is the kind of new partnerships we're able to develop. This is a picture of Drew Lanham out at that black locust stump where the slave quarter is what we're looking to do is to really bring in a multidisciplinary approach to looking at this. And not only does this allow for more information, but also new ways of looking at reconciliation. Because if you look at the way that nature has been able to heal itself from, an incredibly disruptive set of events that occurs with, about 120 years of agriculture to form what appears to be undisturbed woods today. I mean, using that as a way to go towards reconciliation of this very painful past there's all kinds of possibilities there. And the partnership with Drew Lanham we're very excited about for looking towards to move in that direction. And one of the first steps we're doing with this is our continued investigations of the home farm complex with the overseer's house, with the archaeology we've been doing out at the overseers and the home farm. We're making all kinds of discoveries in that area. And it's a way to, get involved with a project that's going to be going on for the next 2 years. And we've got dates we're looking for in July, August, and September for you all to come and join us. But why don't we go ahead and open up the floor for questions, Christy? And I don't know if the raised hand works, or people can ask the questions, or they want to type them. We could, if anybody wants to raise their hand, we could try that.
The first question is lidar granular enough to show old cemetery sites?
It actually is. Where the slave cemetery is, we were able to identify the depressions in that area, but it was kind of cheating, if you will, because we already knew the slave cemetery was there. What lidar is really much better at is not showing small depressions, but more linear features. So anything that's longer than 20 feet, like a ditch or a mound, shows up beautifully in lidar, even if it's only about 6 to 8 inches in height. But when you get into smaller depressions, it's trying to look for those becomes a little bit difficult compared to those linear ones. And I'll go ahead and put. I'm going to stop.
Can artificial intelligence be combined with lidar?
That is actually something that DJ was looking at. DJ Berry, who is the archaeologist that worked here and did his thesis on lidar, he was looking at these point clouds and looking for ways to create scripts that would be able to identify them and put them into a typology. But while that is possible, really the easiest way to do this is with the human eye. It's just the human eye is, it looks for linear patterns, it recognizes them, and then the best way to do it is to go into the field and combine that with field observations and also archaeological survey to see what's in the area. So what we're doing is using a bit of everything that's out there to try to investigate all these features. Let's see if we get some more questions.
Xavier, do you have a question? What was the land like before 1723?
Before 1723, we're thinking that most of this area was in woods. There is a Native American settlement we found up at the main house, but and so that would have had some open savanna that was burnt and kept open by Native Americans, but most of everything else would have been in woodland. And so the first task that slaves would have been clearing those.
Have any of the roads been metal detected or STPs been put in?
That is actually a great question. That is the next step that we want to do with the roads is actually, like this is a great example, which on the screen right here. This is a road that predates this field being opened because what you can see this road coming across here, it's been plowed out by the field in this area, and then it appears again over here. By doing exactly what you stated, which is to run a metal detector along this area, we can, any of these roads have nails and other deposits. We can date the nails and then date the road. So that's why we've been able to date some of the earlier roads that are out there.
Has any work like this been done beyond the Gilmore cabin area?
We have done metal detector survey at the Gilmore cabin, and we found a barn site that was previously not known about, the dates to the 1880s, and then combine the lidar with this to understand the layout of the Gilmore's fields up in that area. So basically, yes, we've been looking at this for the Gilmore cabin and also the Civil War camps up in those areas.
Have there been any first-person accounts from either letters or diaries talking about the Eastwoods area?
The earliest ones we have for the Eastwoods are from the DuPont workers. There are a couple of houses that were out in the Eastwoods, and some of the earlier oral histories were recorded of those. We don't have any documents that directly relate to the Eastwoods except for deeds of sale from between Dolly and the next owner.
What? Oh, I lost my question. Sorry. Have you used this on any of the cemetery areas there?
Yeah, we did this on the slave cemetery and found depressions. And I'm gonna, Christy, I'm gonna play and try to see if I can get Pam here. I'm gonna allow Pam to talk and see what happens. Okay, Pam, I think you're muted, Pam, but maybe you didn't have your, oh, hi, Pam.
Hey there, hi. This has been really neat. I had a friend sign in who was going to come down, and she has really enjoyed this. So I think we got another person interested. I'm glad we could do this way. Never done anything like this before, so really cool.
All right, well, thanks for being here, Pam. Appreciate it. I'm gonna go on. Do you have another question, Pam?
No, not right at the minute. I'm going to have to sign off shortly for my other activity.
All right, good hearing you, Pam.
This has been great. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Kristen.
Do you believe the Gilmore cabin was the only dwelling in that area?
For up in the Northwoods, actually, let me share screens again, and we can skip up to. No, there. What we found up in the Northwoods is. I'm going to go. Bear with me for 1 second. I'm going to get to the Northwoods here. Let's see. All right, we're back, and you can see this is, oh, let me switch. Here, okay. This area up in here is the Gilmore cabin, and you can see, oh, let me do my my highlighter or the laser pointer. Up in here is where the Gilmore cabin is. Here's Route 20 coming along down here. We've metal detected the property that was owned by the Gilmores. And what we've found through metal detector surveys, we've found 3 or 4 slave quarters up in the Northwoods that date to the late 18th and the early 19th century. After the Gilmores purchased their land in the 1870s, however, we found two former slave quarters that were occupied by emancipated slaves up until the 1880s. But by the 1890s, the only family that's up here of former slaves is the Gilmores.
Early in the chat, Matt mentioned papers being destroyed. Can you speak to the destruction of Madison papers in the 1850s? Who did it and why, if known?
Yeah, that's one of the more frustrating aspects that we've got here at Montpelier. There's a newspaper account after John Payne died. This is the stepson of James Madison, Dolly's son from her first marriage. After Dolly sells the property in 1844, he amasses all the family documents at his home down in Gordonsville. And when he dies in 1853, all of James Madison's nieces and nephews go to his house at Toddsworth in Gordonsville, literally find 2 rooms full of documents, take all these out into the backyard and burn them. And the reason why they said they burned them is because their Uncle Jimmy was a very private man, and he didn't want anyone digging into his history. So, but probably, a key part of this was, wanting to keep private all of the activities associated at Montpelier with the sale of slaves. And with the burning of those documents, we lost any maps that would have been of the fields that were out at Montpelier, where slave quarters were, lists of slaves, ledger books about agricultural production. And that's what makes the archaeology that we're doing with the lidar, the metal detector survey, and excavation so valuable.
What is the distribution of surface rocks? Is this a hindrance to lidar?
Not so much. There's not a lot of rocks that are out in the woods at Montpelier. The soil horizon at Montpelier is incredibly well weathered. So it means you need to go down about 60 to 70 feet to hit bedrock, which means you don't have the large amounts of rocks you have like in New England or other parts of Virginia, at Montpelier. So just these clay soils that are fairly resistant to erosion, except when they're exposed.
Would all structures be expected to have nails, or would some be wooden peg structures only? If the latter, how would you identify those sites?
Yeah, fortunately, with having roofs on these buildings, like whether they're clapboards or weatherboards, the only way to attach those is with nails, and nails are cheap enough where that would be the fasteners of choice. So while there's a lot of most of the outbuildings that we've found, they're more than likely log structures because the pine trees would be readily available with abandoned fields. But fortunately, pretty much everything wherever human activity is taking place, work by enslaved laborers, you're finding these concentration of nails that allow them to be identified. So we're really glad nails are everywhere.
What is I've already asked this question, but what is the most surprising thing you found in the East Woods?
Boy, I would say the most surprising thing we found were those ditches. Those literally blew my mind. The ones that were, we walked down there with the video and saw those double lines of streams. The amount of work that went into digging those ditches would have been just absolutely mind-numbing. And then to have those ditches still survive today, meaning that they haven't washed out, they haven't filled up with sediment. The engineering that went into creating those, and who would have been digging and building those would have been the enslaved community. It's in many ways, in terms of the labor that would have been involved, is almost monumental in and of itself. So I would say those ditches and the evidence for tobacco farming that's down there in the East Woods is the most spectacular. And then there's all the artifacts we found, but in terms of just mind-numbing, I'd say the ditches. And what's neat is those ditches are everywhere across the property. Once we found them in the East Woods, what we began to identify is these ditches, all the streams at Montpelier have been basically reworked. All the bottomlands have been reworked for agricultural activities.
Can artificial intelligence be combined with lidar?
Oh yeah, I talked about that one before. It's best is the eyeball. That's human intelligence is the best. It can be done, but.
Was cotton farmed? When did it start?
Cotton we don't have evidence for here. It was the wrong kind of soil, and also by the time you get to this time period, when cotton is being after the cotton baler, or not the cotton baler, but the cotton. It's like the threshing machine that de-seeds the cotton. Where cotton production is happening is in the deep South, like in the new territories of Louisiana, Mississippi, Arkansas.
You mentioned a threshing barn. Where was the grain ground?
The grain would have been ground at two mills. One of the mills was when you head north out of Orange and you cross over the Rapidan River. There was a mill that was there until about a decade ago. That was one of the Madison mills. The other Madison mill is if you're heading south out of Orange on Route 15, right where 15 crosses Chicken Mountain Road. Off to the left, going in the other direction away from Montpelier, is Madison Run Road. That's where the other Madison grain mill was.
The ditches, at which period were they done? Madison Senior or Madison Junior or before?
The ditches that we found are all Madison Junior. And how we've been able to establish the evidence for when that happened is based on the dates of the barns that we found or that are associated with those ditches, and the fact that the ditches are dug through eroded sediments that only would have been caused with plowing of the uplands. So it's this sequence. And actually, one thing I'm going to send everybody is a GIS web map. I'm going to send this early next week when I've got it better formulated. And also I'll attach to that a more extensive document that talks about the Eastwoods report that I've written up.
What were the winters like?
What were the winters like? The winters would have been a period probably when there would have been a lot of repairs going on. That's probably when a lot of these ditches would have been repaired. You would have had work with repairing tools. There would have been, refined production of cloths and more blacksmithing that would have occurred, because we've got evidence from multiple work sites. What we're thinking is during the wintertime, a lot of the slaves are brought into what we call the home farm quarter, which is just below the visitor center. And there probably would have been more centralized labor occurring in the wintertime. But then in the summer, people would have been scattered, more broadly across the plantation for working the fields.
Are there any future plans to do excavations and reconstruction in the woods areas similar to what's been done near the mansion?
Our near-term plans are to build trails to access some of these sites. And what we want to do is actually use the remnant road traces that are out there as the roads or the paths, the walking trails. So literally you'll be able to follow in the footsteps where the enslaved community were using for their roads. I think what we need to do first in those areas is do excavations, but in the near term, what I'd love to do is do a lot more interpretation out there and get more people, seeing these parts of Montpelier.
Was Madison Jr. a self-taught civil engineer, or who might have designed the ditch projects?
That is something we have been wondering about. I mean, while Madison was reading about information about ditching and treatises, agricultural treatises of the time period, it would have been up to the slaves who are digging these ditches to really make this work, because the enslaved community would have been the group of people that knew where the best fields were, where the best soils were, what happens with erosion. So there's a number of these quarters that were being run by enslaved overseers. So it would have taken the working knowledge of the laborers to actually do this work. There's probably little survey that was done by an engineer type of person to do this. But again, it's something we're looking at with the studies we're doing.
Has ground penetrating radar been used on future plans or future plans to use it for cemeteries or other uses?
Yeah, we actually just did a ground penetrating radar survey of the slave cemetery, and we were able to figure out that it's about 10 times the size that we thought it was. And we're working with the descendant community now for memorialization of that space. So it's another tool in our arsenal for discovering the past.
Is today's Chicken Mountain Road the route taken to the Madison Mill across Route 15, or was there a different path through the woods alongside of it?
Yeah, Chicken Mountain Road, where it comes into Westgate Road today, that would have been all the farm pond. And actually, if I go back to sharing screens here, let's see, and let me see what slide I have for this. Yeah, so this is Chicken Mountain right here. This is the area of the where the where the where the mill was. All this area would have been flooded. So the route that would have been taken to the mill would have been to go over to Route 15, would have been up across here and then over and down to Route 15 in this direction.
Are there any old bridges on the property?
We've got some bridges from the DuPont era. We don't have any Madison era bridges.
Can you do more of these, please? I'd love to see the Civil War encampment area again and the slave cemetery and how it's more extensive than originally thought. It's more of a comment.
Yeah, we're making plans for doing more of these webinars. So this is something we really want to engage in. So. Okay, well, thank you for everyone and for, wow, 23 people that have hung on for an hour and a half. This is great. Oh, there is one more question. Okay.
Besides metal detecting, are there other roles for volunteers?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, one thing that I showed as one of the last screens was, let's see, let me get out of this and go to the last screen right here. We've got a number of programs that we've got scheduled. Let's see. Yeah, so one of the main ways we have people to get involved is with our excavation programs. And right now we're working on the home farm complex, and that's where folks can come out and actually work in a unit with us. In the near term, we actually have a, now that everybody is homebound right now with this virus going on, we do have a online volunteer project that you can write me about. And who asked that question?
I dismissed the question.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, email me at either at dig@montpelier.org or mreeves@montpelier.org, and I can give you some more information on that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to send everybody at the end of this the paper that I've written on the Eastwoods, and then also later on in the week this website that we're creating on the Eastwoods showing the mapping. And I'll also put in the email I'll send late on Monday information on some of the volunteer programs that we've got. Yeah.
And I just wanted to chime in too about someone asking, will we be doing more of these webinars? And yes, we will. And so I would urge you to check our website often and our Facebook page often, because we are developing these, a few days at a time, and you'll be seeing these. A lot of the walks and things that we've had scheduled for April, a lot of them are hikes that will be turning into virtual tours. It's just taking us a little time. So be patient, but we'd like to see you to continue to participate. We appreciate your support.
Yeah, this is the first webinar that we've done. So if you have any suggestions for how to make them better, we're all ears. Any critiques of my cinematography skills, I'd be glad to hear. So, Christy, are there any more questions?
No, just a lot of thank yous. So
okay, well, thank you all for listening, and we as we get more of these scheduled, we'll send out emails to you all. So thanks, and hope you all are safe and enjoying the rest of your Sunday. Bye, everybody, and thanks, Christy, for helping out.
it was a pleasure. Thank you all for tuning in.
Bye-bye.